Most people think of the United Kingdom as an archipelago of islands in Europe, comprising the nations of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. But there's a secret side to the UK that few fully appreciate. 14 UK overseas territories are scattered across the globe. These archipelagos and peninsulas are Britain's treasure islands. Their wealth is the incredible biodiversity that they hold. From rainforests to deserts to glaciers, they're home to every major habitat on Earth, as well as over 1,000 unique terrestrial species that occur nowhere else on the planet. In total, more than 95% of the UK's biodiversity is found on the country's overseas territories. The diversity of wildlife on land is impressive, but each of the UK overseas territories is surrounded by vast tracts of waters, home to diverse marine ecosystems. From tropical reefs to frigid Antarctic seas, temperate kelp forests, to the depths of the ocean floor. The coastal waters of many of the UK overseas territories are key breeding grounds for marine life, and they are of critical importance for the survival of many threatened species. Through the UK overseas territories, the UK is responsible for the 5th largest ocean estate in the world. It's the only country on the planet with waters in all 7 seas. The North Atlantic and Caribbean are home to the greatest number of UK overseas territories. Bermuda, the Turks and Caicos Islands, Anguilla, Montserrat, the British Virgin Islands, and the Cayman Islands. These tropical waters are home to diverse reefs filled with sponges and corals. The shapes, nooks, and crannies of the reefs provide varied habitats for marine life. Although some of the reef's residents perhaps don't always choose the most effective of places to hide, the reefs provide abundant food. A hungry hawksbill turtle is looking for a meal. Its sharp beak-like jaws enables it to scrape sponges and other morsels from the reef. The diversity of fish life in the waters of the Caribbean UK overseas territories is astounding. A pair of porcupine fish are also looking for food, while stingrays glide over the sand, sensing for buried mollusks. The waters of the Cayman Islands are of particular importance for the Nassau grouper, one of the largest species of reef fish in the Caribbean. Every year, thousands of groupers swim together to congregate at breeding sites. The groupers swim from kilometers away. No one yet knows how the groupers know where to meet or when, but somehow they synchronize their movements and come together. Under the light of the moon, immense numbers congregate. Once thousands of groupers have collected together, suddenly a spawning female races upwards towards the surface of the water. She is followed by several males that fertilize the eggs she releases. The ritual repeats through the night as countless millions of grouper eggs are released. Grouper breeding aggregation sites like this one were once widespread across the Caribbean, but as soon as each site was found, the fish were immediately targeted by fishermen. Catching the concentrated spawning groupers was easier than shooting fish in a barrel. So many groupers could be caught so quickly that often the fish rotted on the docks before they could be sold, and most of the region's breeding sites have since been wiped out. In 2001, This breeding site was discovered in the waters of the Cayman Islands. Just like most of the other grouper breeding sites, it too was targeted by fishermen. But the Cayman Islands government quickly protected it during the spawning months. The Grouper Moon project has monitored the site and recorded a rise in numbers from 1,200 fish in 2009 to over 8,000 in 2020. This dramatic spectacle not only attracts divers from across the world to the Cayman Islands, but this protected grouper breeding site may now help to replenish the grouper population across the wider region. Unfortunately, a deadly underwater menace stalks these reefs. Non-native lionfish, armed with venomous spines. No one knows for sure how they reached the Caribbean. Perhaps as pets released into the sea, or as spawn transported in the bilges of ships. But lionfish numbers have exploded as few native predators can eat them. Lionfish devastate populations of small native reef fish, and in some areas, they represent over 80% of all fish locally present. Divers across the Caribbean UK overseas territories are fighting back and systematically cull the lionfish in an attempt to save the native species. The meat of the hunted lionfish is sold in supermarkets. Every lionfish consumed is one less on the reefs eating native marine life, and also one less native fish that has to be caught by fishermen for the plate. Across the Caribbean, the meat of queen conchs has been prized for centuries. The shores of Anegada in the British Virgin Islands are home to entire islands made of conch shells. These have accumulated over centuries, partly as a result of overfishing. Sadly, the queen conch population has declined across much of the Caribbean in recent years. But more stringent monitoring efforts are allowing the stocks to rebuild once more, which is good for the local fishermen, as well as the conchs. Ascension Island is a UK overseas territory located in the warm waters of the South Atlantic. It's a barren volcanic island, home to vast seabird populations that depend upon the territory's waters for food, and the island's slopes to breed. The large bird colonies can only survive here because of the wealth of fish in Ascension's waters. An immense marine protected area was recently set up around Ascension Island. The new reserve covers over 440,000 square kilometres of waters and protects the territory's diverse marine life. For a few weeks each year, the seabirds are joined by thousands of green sea turtles, which swim to the island to lay their eggs. It's the second largest nesting site for this endangered species in the entire Atlantic, with around 25,000 nests dug on Ascension's beaches each year. As the sun sets, the turtles clamber on shore and dig their nests in the dark of night. The next morning, the last of the turtles return back to the sea, along with hatchlings from the first nests of the season. The parched volcanic landscape of Ascension Island might not seem like an obvious place for aquatic life. But even here, aquatic life flourishes in a few places. These two tiny pools, set in the lava flows of the island, are miniature worlds of unique life. Several species of endemic shrimps are found here and nowhere else on Earth. Some of the shrimps graze algae, while other species of shrimps prey on the grazers. This ecosystem of life is fully contained within these tiny pools, oblivious to the rest of the world. Moving further south, the UK overseas territories of Tristan da Cunha, the Falkland Islands, and South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands occupy colder, temperate and subpolar waters. The islands here are fringed with kelp forests. The kelp can grow really quickly, up to 60 centimeters a day, and individual fronds may be up to 45 meters long. These underwater forests are rich with marine life and serve as important nursery areas for countless species of fish, including a Tristan wrasse that is so colourful that it looks as if it belongs on a tropical coral reef. An octopus also hides away amongst the kelp, and the rocky seafloor serves as an important habitat for grazing sea urchins. But of all of the animals here, it's the seals and sea lions that regard these waters as their playground. They pirouette effortlessly amongst the giant kelp and into the deeper waters beyond. They're as curious of divers as we are of them, and one explores a camera lens, perhaps attracted by its own reflection. Further south still, the British Antarctic Territory is a slice of the white continent dominated by ice. Ice sheets and glaciers reach the waters and carve off as icebergs. The ice pounds the seabed of the shallows and scours the sea floor. Giant icebergs may be kilometers in size and drift through these frigid waters like floating islands. They create an entrancing world of ice, at first glance, perhaps seemingly sterile. But the ice actually holds an incredible secret. Every winter, the sub-zero temperatures causes the sea to freeze. The continent of Antarctica effectively doubles in size as the sea surface becomes covered with sea ice. The floating ice forms important habitats for many species of seals. But perhaps more importantly, over winter and spring, algae and phytoplankton grow within the ice itself and in the less salty surface water as the sea ice melts. The release of countless tons of algae, phytoplankton and nutrients causes an explosion of underwater life, as if fed by fish food from above. Divers from the British Antarctic Survey's Rothera Research Station regularly survey and study the marine life underneath the ice. Once a hole in the ice is cut, the divers are ready for a dip. In they go. And diving here is like journeying to another world. The divers are tethered with ropes, for if they lost their way back to the entrance hole, there would be no returning back to the surface. A mistake would be lethal. Compared to the white icy surface above, life is astonishingly diverse on the seabed, with starfish, sea urchins, anemones, and several species of fish. New species continue to be discovered in these southern waters. Some marine biologists estimate that over 17,000 different types of organism may live on the Antarctic continental shelf alone. We're also only beginning to realize how slowly life can take place down here. Many species of marine invertebrates are now known to live for centuries, And some species of Antarctic glass sponges are believed to live for up to 15,000 years. With the icy sojourn complete, the divers returned safely back to the surface. The vast concentrations of marine life in the waters of the southern UK overseas territories support unimaginable concentrations of marine mammals and seabirds. Millions of seals and penguins breed on the shores of South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, and the Falkland Islands each year. On South Georgia alone, it's estimated that over 4 million fur seals rear their young each year. Massive elephant seals battle for control of the beaches and rest for a few weeks ashore during the summer season. Colonies of hundreds of thousands of king penguins cover the coastal flats and form moving seas of bodies. Each pair nurtures their own chick and takes it in turn to hunt for fish to feed to their offspring. The Falkland Islands are home to large concentrations of gentoo penguins, which scamper ashore clumsily. But under the waves, they transform and fly through the water with the grace of acrobats. It can be difficult to remember that these are underwater birds. The Falkland Islands are also home to the world's largest colonies of black-browed albatrosses. Tens of thousands of pairs nest together at several sites around the archipelago to rear their young. But back offshore, the largest animals ever to exist roam the waters of the Southern Ocean. The bounty of krill draws many species of the great baleen whales. This incredible abundance of marine life did not go unnoticed. In the early 20th century, vast whaling stations were set up across South Georgia to hunt and process the great whales. For over 6 decades, up to 3,000 men at a time worked on these stations with one goal: to process the great whales into oil, meat, fertilizer, and countless other products. Tens of thousands of whales were hunted from the ocean with devastating results. The whale populations soon crashed. The last whaling station on South Georgia closed in 1966, but these vast tanks still drip with the oil that the whalers sought. And for one species, the whaling operations were catastrophic. The blue whale. The population of this species is believed to have been reduced to between 1% and 0.1% of its natural numbers. Had whaling continued for just 1 year more, it's believed that there would have been too few blue whales left in the oceans to reproduce sustainably. The biggest animal that ever existed could have slipped into extinction. Just imagine if these bones were all we had to show our children of the largest animals that ever evolved on Earth. But whaling did end just in time, simply because there were too few whales left in the waters for the industry to be profitable. Five decades on, all whales are now fully protected in the waters of all UK overseas territories. And their numbers are exploding back. Humpbacks are feeding in the waters around South Georgia once more. And 2020 saw record numbers of blue whales. Hope is restored. Conservation is about what we still have, not what we have lost. And the waters of the UK Overseas Territories show time and time again that populations of species can recover if given the chance. It's not too late. We can pull many species back from the brink of extinction if we care enough to act now. As we better appreciate and continue to explore more of Britain's distant seas, incredible discoveries continue to be made. A British Antarctic Survey remote-operated vehicle descends from the surface into the waters around the South Sandwich Islands. The underwater world here has only ever been glimpsed on a few previous occasions. As the ROV submerges, it encounters the tentacles of a 7-meter-long jellyfish. Then, out of the darkness, active geothermal vents emerge, an alien world few have ever seen before. The ROV discovers dense groups of peltasterid snails adapted to the extreme conditions. And nearby, large numbers of yeti crabs. These strange crustaceans are covered with silky strands that appear to cultivate symbiotic bacteria. They spend their adult lives clinging to the rocks, feeding off bacteria, and scavenging any morsels of food that they can find. Nearby, the ROV finds an active hot smoker. This vent billows superheated water rich with minerals that fuels this miniature ecosystem isolated in the darkness of the waters of the South Atlantic. The British Antarctic Survey researchers collect samples, and the rover begins to return to the surface. What other finds might await discovery in these little-known waters? At warmer latitudes, the British Indian Ocean Territory is the only UK overseas territory in the Indian Ocean. The 5 atolls that make up the territory are scattered over 600,000 square kilometres of tropical seas. Each atoll is a gigantic ring of coral, punctuated with small islands, but the shallows across the archipelago are home to at least 4,000 square kilometres of coral reefs. These are the largest expanses of coral reefs in all of the UK overseas territories. At least 300 species of corals have been recorded from the territory, and they form exquisite underwater coral gardens. The coral grows in a myriad of shapes and forms, and it accumulates to form the islands that make up the territory. Virtually the entire land surface of the British Indian Ocean Territory exists because of the slow growth of the coral reefs over tens of thousands of years. At least one species of coral, the Chagos brain coral, occurs nowhere else on Earth. The coral itself forms the basis of much of the food chain. Parrotfish use their powerful beak-like jaws to scrape the coral polyps from the hard, stony coral growths. Parrotfish excrete much of the sand that washes ashore to form the beaches around the islands. The total number of fish species that occur in the waters of the territory is still not known, but at least 800 types have been recorded to date, including around a quarter of all reef fish species known on Earth. The colors of the reef fish here are as dazzling as a rainbow, and several are found nowhere else, including the Chagos anemone fish, which hides from predators among the stinging tentacles of an anemone, against whose stings it's immune. On shore, no mammals, amphibians, or large reptiles are native. So these islands are ruled by land crabs and birds. Countless land hermit crabs rummage through the vegetation, scavenging whatever they can find. But a much larger invertebrate rules here: the coconut crab, the largest terrestrial arthropod alive today, with a leg span that can reach 90 centimeters across. These gigantic relatives of hermit crabs are so called because they can break open fallen coconuts with their powerful claws. This species is endangered throughout most of its range across the Indian and Pacific Oceans because it's been hunted intensively for its meat. But here, on the British Indian Ocean Territory, one of the world's largest populations remains intact. All land crabs are tied to the sea. While adults can't breathe underwater, they return to the shore to drink and to release their eggs. The islands of the British Indian Ocean Territory are filled with seabird colonies, which also depend on the waters of the territory for their food. These bird colonies are now strictly protected, and virtually the entire area of the waters of the territories, some 2/3 of a million square kilometers, have been established as one of the largest marine reserves on Earth. While this is excellent news for the conservation of wildlife, a growing threat is endangering the marine ecosystem of the territory. Massive coral bleaching events have recently struck tropical seas around the world as a result of warming water surface temperatures. The corals of the British Indian Ocean Territory turn unusual colors as a stress response to the heat. Marine biologists explain this phenomenon as the coral reefs adopting a form of sunscreen. They expel or lose their algal partners, then turn these unusual colors before bleaching white and dying. The algae photosynthesize and nourish the corals. Without algae, the entire ecosystem crashes. Coral once dominated the shallows of the British Indian Ocean Territory, but in some areas, the coral coverage has already fallen to less than 10%. As the dead corals erode, and as little new corals form and accumulate, the long-term future of these low-lying islands may be in jeopardy. On the other side of the world, the Pitcairn Islands are the only UK overseas territory in the Pacific Ocean. This remote archipelago of 4 small islands also comprises enormous stretches of water, over 800,000 square kilometers, with extensive reefs. The reefs here are rich with coral species, including some of the deepest occurring photosynthetic corals in the world. Testimony to the territory's exceptionally clear waters. Similar to the British Indian Ocean Territory, virtually all of Pitcairn's waters have been designated as a marine protected area, one of the very largest in the world. And this offers a refuge for marine life, much of which has been heavily overfished in other parts of the Pacific. Sadly though, even here, within these protected waters, the marine life is not always safe. An abandoned fishing net is dragged along the fragile reefs, lethal to fish and other animals that become entangled as it smashes its way through the delicate corals. These so-called ghost nets can continue causing damage for years. Conservationists try hard to cut the net free and eventually bring it to the surface, where it's removed for disposal. Despite the threats that they face, the UK Overseas Territories are home to some of the least impacted marine ecosystems on Earth. In total, over 5.5 million square kilometres of waters. Various marine protected areas have already been established around several of the overseas territories, including some of the largest marine reserves on Earth. Around 1/3 of Britain's distant seas are now protected to differing extents, and many further reserves are currently being discussed for possible implementation around further UK overseas territories to expand the protection of nature. The urgency to conserve the planet's marine ecosystem has never been greater. Only by permanently protecting and caring for our marine wildlife can we pass on the natural treasures of our world to the next generation, for all to appreciate and admire. Many of the UK overseas territories lie in the tropics, so have many species of reptiles and amphibians, including some of the rarest on Earth. There are 6 separate territories scattered across the Caribbean and North Atlantic. On the Cayman Islands, there are several kinds of large iguanas found nowhere else, and some are not hard to find. On Little Cayman, Sister Isles iguanas are happy to loaf around on the porch outside the local museum. The forests of Grand Cayman were once home to large numbers of an extraordinary animal, the blue iguana. It relishes fallen fruits, and the rich forests on Grand Cayman once gave it a perfect home. But forest clearance in this popular part of the Caribbean, along with introduced predators like cats and dogs, reduced this species to just a few individuals. The fact that they are once again living in these forests is down to the efforts of a few dedicated conservationists. Fred Burton and his team set up an iguana breeding station, to which they brought the last few individuals they could find. Under careful management, they began to build up the population.
Yeah. So you can see how the numbers are really
Great.
like going crazy.
Young iguanas are reared until they're large enough to stand a good chance of survival, then released back into the wild. The wild population is now increasing, and soon Fred hopes to be able to close down this facility. Habitat loss and introduced predators are huge problems for many of the Caribbean's reptiles and amphibians. The forests of Montserrat are home to a frog, now rare in the wild. To find it means a night search in the rainforest. A mountain chicken.
Yeah, they got one. They got one?
Yeah. And it's simply enormous. These frogs are carefully monitored by conservationists, and this one is an old friend.
We first caught this individual last summer, so we've been tracking this one for nearly a year. Age-wise, it's fairly adult frog. Really? It's a decent size, yeah.
So why is he called the mountain chicken?
Well, the mountain chicken, it's a very interesting name. Obviously there are no feathers, but in the thighs here there's a lot of flesh. It's a big meaty thigh. Obviously they're a very large frog, and people actually used to hunt and eat these frogs. So they used to take the legs off and fry them up in a pan, and people used to say that it would look like the chicken wing and it would taste like chicken. They were hunted out a lot. Here in Montserrat there was a lot of hunting going on in the residential areas, so the population was reduced very much. But out here in the Centre Hills, for example, there was still a thriving population despite the hunting.
Apart from the problems of habitat loss and predators, frogs also face a deadly threat from an infectious fungus called chytrid. So every time they catch a frog, they test it for infections.
The tests that we run will actually not only tell us whether this frog has chytrid, but it will also tell us how much chytrid is on the skin.
So time to put this one back where we found him. Many of the Caribbean territories are also home to endemic snakes. The Turks and Caicos Islands has several unusual endemic species, such as the Caicos Islands dwarf boa, one of the smallest boa species in the whole world, or the Turks Islands rainbow boa, so called for it has iridescent scales. The biggest battle facing the Caribbean conservationists is invasive species brought here by humans. But not all introduced species seem to be a problem. The red-footed tortoise arrived here long before Columbus, brought here by Indians colonizing the Caribbean islands from South America. So it's been here a long time and seems to have settled down without causing any problems. Heading east and into the center of the Atlantic, the tiny island of Ascension is also an important place for reptiles. At night, these beaches draw large numbers of green turtles.
I can see, yeah, that's one coming out the water right there.
These females have travelled 2,000 kilometres from feeding grounds off the coast of Brazil to this tiny speck of land in the middle of the ocean to dig their nests and lay eggs. It's an enormous effort to haul their bulk up and down the beach, yet this female will probably do it up to half a dozen times each breeding season. A few females are just finishing as dawn breaks and face an urgent trek back down to the sea. Here on the equator, the fierce sun will bake them if they delay too long. So many turtles crawl up these beaches that often later females dig up the nests of earlier ones, a surprise feast for Sally Lightfoot crabs. After 2 months, those eggs that survive hatch, and the young turtles make a frantic dash down to the sea to avoid predatory crabs on the beaches and birds in the air. The turtle population on Ascension was decimated during the 18th and 19th centuries as they were collected for food by passing ships. Now under careful protection, the population has risen, making Ascension the second largest green turtle colony in the Atlantic. Across the territories, conservation efforts have been making a difference for some of the rarest reptiles and amphibians on Earth. The Britain's Treasure Islands book explores the unique wildlife, cultures and history of all of the UK overseas territories. Visit britain.treasureislands.com for details. In sincere thanks to Lord Ashcroft for funding the donation of 1 copy of the Britain's Treasure Islands book to every secondary school across the UK and her overseas territories. Thanks also to all Kickstarter backers and all sponsors and partners for making the 40 mini-documentaries possible. Who would have thought that Britain is home to some of the greatest bird spectacles on Earth? Noisy colonies of penguins, hundreds of thousands of albatrosses, flamingos, lorikeets, and frigate birds. Scattered across all 7 seas, the UK overseas territories are some of the most important places for birds on the planet. Many of the territories are home to endemic land birds, which evolved into new species in isolation. The isolated outcrop of St. Helena was home to a unique species of cuckoo, as well as an endemic crake, a swamp hen, a hoopoe, and several petrels. But all of these are now extinct. Only one of the island's unique birds survives. The lyrebird, a kind of plover. The extinctions resulted as a consequence of introduced mammal predators, especially cats and rats. Over 1,000 kilometers to the north, on Ascension Island, there's a similar story. Many of Ascension's seabirds were wiped out when cats and rats jumped ship and invaded the island. The only sanctuary was a tiny offshore rock, Bosenbird Island. This is now home to Ascension's unique seabird, the Ascension frigatebird, which occurs nowhere else on Earth. The goal of conservationists working on Ascension is now to make the main island safe once more. A feral cat eradication scheme was completed in 2004, and soon after, some seabirds began to return to the main island, but not the Ascension frigatebird. So conservationists tried to convince the frigates by using models. And finally, in 2013, the Ascension Island frigatebird bred back on the mainland, the first time for over 180 years. But some of the UK overseas territories still have their assemblages of unique birds. Henderson Island is part of the territory of the Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific. It's home to several unique species. The Henderson lorikeet, a tiny parrot. The Henderson fruit dove, and the flightless Henderson rail. And although seabirds can range far and wide over the ocean, one returns to nest only on Henderson Island. The Henderson petrel. Several species of flamingos call the overseas territories home. Populations of American flamingos in the British Virgin Islands were hunted for their meat and feathers, and eventually they were completely wiped out. But the species was successfully reintroduced from stock from Bermuda, and ever larger numbers inhabit the islands once more. Half a world away, in the centre of the Indian Ocean, lies the Chagos Archipelago, the British Indian Ocean territory. Unlike Ascension, these are low-lying coral islands covered in lush tropical vegetation. But these too are home to vast colonies of tropical seabirds, red-footed boobies, and sooty terns, which live right around the tropics. But Britain is also home to birds of the cold Southern Ocean. Tristan da Cunha is a massive volcano rising over 2,000 meters above sea level. Partway up, there's a plateau covered in dwarf tree ferns. All of the world's Atlantic yellow-nosed albatrosses come to the Tristan group of islands to court and breed. "4,000 kilometers to the southwest, the Falkland Islands are home to around 70% of the entire population of black-browed albatrosses. That's around 500,000 birds. The chicks take 4 months to fledge and spend their time perched on top of tall nest mounds made of mud. The UK overseas territories are also important for penguins. The Falkland Islands hold the largest breeding colonies of gentoo penguins in the world. They feed in the rich waters around the islands, but their breeding colonies are often several kilometres inland, a long trek for a penguin. Big seabird colonies often draw other birds. Striated caracaras are the world's most southerly bird of prey, though they mainly live by scavenging. 5 different kinds of penguins breed on the Falklands. Around a third of the world's population of southern rockhoppers live here. The smallest penguin on the Falklands, but perhaps the most charismatic. Northern rockhoppers look very similar, but this penguin is endangered. Over the last half-century, its population has fallen dramatically. Over half the world population nests on the islands of the Tristan da Cunha group, making this remote part of Britain vitally important for the bird's future. The most spectacular penguin colonies in the UK overseas territories are those of king penguins on South Georgia, an island on the edge of the Antarctic, 3,000 kilometres south of Tristan. And there's good news for these penguins. Globally, their numbers have been rising in recent years. South Georgia is home to around a third of the world population. South Georgia is home to some of the greatest seabird spectacles on Earth. In all, some 50 million birds breed here. Gentoo penguins, wandering albatrosses, and many other species. Giant petrels, the vultures of the Southern Ocean, make a living by scavenging or killing weak or wounded birds. Scattered across the world, from the Antarctic to the equator, the UK overseas territories are amongst the most important areas on the planet for birds. The Britain's Treasure Islands book explores the unique wildlife, cultures and history of all of the UK overseas territories. Visit britain.treasureislands.com for details. In sincere thanks to Lord Ashcroft for funding the donation of 1 copy of the Britain's Treasure Islands book to every secondary school across the UK and her overseas territories. Thanks also to all Kickstarter backers and all sponsors and partners for making the 40 mini-documentaries possible. Ranging from the tropics to the Antarctic, the UK Overseas Territories are home to some spectacular mammals. The most famous of all the mammals that occur across the territories are undoubtedly the Barbary macaques of Gibraltar. Today, about 150 macaques live on the rock, forming 6 troops. The macaques here are Europe's only wild primates. The macaques are as famous as the rock itself, and as many as 800,000 tourists are drawn to Gibraltar's upper slopes each year to see the macaques at close quarters. Gibraltar and many of the Caribbean UK Overseas Territories are home to many species of bats. One of the greatest concentrations of all occurs on the lush forested slopes of Montserrat. 10 species occur on this island, and many act as natural pollinators. But in 1995, the volcano at the island's centre exploded, and it was feared that many of the bats might be wiped out. The acidity of the ash caused many of the bats to lose their fur, and many of the fruit-eating species lost their teeth due to the abrasive action of the ash that covered the fruit that they ate. But happily, enough of Montserrat's bats survived, and the populations are now recovering. Generally, few land mammals reach really remote islands, so many of the UK Overseas Territories are visited only by marine mammals. Bottlenose dolphins swim through the clear tropical waters of the British Indian Ocean Territory, around the Chagos archipelago. In complete contrast, the waters of Tristan da Cunha in the southern Atlantic are churned by the roaring Forties, incessant winds that circle the globe at this high latitude. Tristan itself is a huge volcano, rising to over 2,000 meters, the world's most remote inhabited island. Yet thanks to wind and ocean currents churning up nutrients, the waters are incredibly rich. Tristanians make a good living from fishing and catching lobsters. Yet, we aren't the only mammals to benefit from this abundance. Swimming through the forests of giant kelp, subantarctic fur seals. An abundance of food leaves plenty of time for play. Further south again, the British Antarctic Territory is a world of ice. Home to leopard seals. And crab-eater seals. These too are rich waters, and draw some of the biggest mammals of all. Humpback whales travel here from tropical calving grounds just to feed. But these waters haven't always been a sanctuary for the great whales. In the past, they were hunted and killed for their blubber. The sheer abundance of bones on these shores is a testament to the scale of the slaughter.
The bones of the great whales that were slaughtered over the last century or so, they're still here, preserved in the cold.
Today, the seas surrounding Antarctica are an international whale sanctuary, and numbers are recovering. The smaller dolphins fare better. Around the shores of the Falkland Islands, large schools of Cormoran's dolphins are a frequent sight. On the Falklands' remote beaches, elephant seals haul up to rest and molt. As the breeding season approaches, the big males grow restless and begin to challenge rivals for space on the beach. But to see the UK territory's most spectacular abundance of mammals means travelling 1,500 kilometres to the east, to the remote island of South Georgia. Large numbers of elephant seals haul up on beaches crowded with penguins, and the males are really impressive.
These elephant seals weigh up to 4 tons. That's over 40 times my weight.
And they use that weight to challenge rivals. Usually, the heaviest seal wins. And the dominant male, the beachmaster, will mate with all the females on his patch of beach. The beaches are also crowded with Antarctic fur seals, a different species to those found on Tristan. They mix with large colonies of king and gentoo penguins, though not always peacefully.
Unlike Antarctica, South Georgia is covered by these low grassy hummocks. And this vegetation is a very important difference. It allows many of the animals to breed and rear young here.
Like the great whales, fur seals were hunted to the edge of extinction. But under protection, their numbers have risen. There are now some 4 million on South Georgia. One of the most spectacular gatherings of mammals anywhere on Earth. The Britain's Treasure Islands book explores the unique wildlife, cultures and history of all of the UK overseas territories. Visit britain.treasureislands.com for details. In sincere thanks to Lord Ashcroft for funding the donation of 1 copy of the Britain's Treasure Islands book to every secondary school across the UK and her overseas territories. Thanks also to all Kickstarter backers and all sponsors and partners for making the 40 mini-documentaries possible. Scattered across all 7 seas, the UK overseas territories hold some of the most important marine environments on the planet. From colourful tropical Pacific reefs to those of the Indian Ocean, down to the freezing waters of Antarctica and the rich waters of the subantarctic. In all these places, the marine life is spectacular. Lost in the vastness of the Pacific, the territory of Pitcairn is made up of several small islands, each surrounded by coral reefs. Off Pitcairn itself, shoals of grassy chub congregate over exposed surf-swept ridges. In more sheltered areas, corals provide homes for a colourful assortment of fish. "200 kilometres from Pitcairn lies Henderson Island. It's been uninhabited for several hundred years, so its reefs have had a chance to recover from fishing. In crystal clear water, there's an extraordinary diversity and abundance of fish. Half a world away, in the centre of the Indian Ocean, the Chagos Archipelago makes up the British Indian Ocean territory, more than 5 times the surface area of the UK mainland. It's made up of 7 huge coral atolls. One, the Great Chagos Bank, is the largest atoll in the world. This is the cleanest water on the planet, supporting exuberant growths of coral. On the Chagos Atolls, there's coral growing on coral, growing on coral. And the complex 3-dimensional structure of the reef provides shelter for an amazing diversity of fish. More than 800 species have been recorded here so far, about a quarter of all the kinds of reef fishes on Earth. All these reefs are now part of a marine protected area, the largest no-take zone on the planet. And that protects not just these spectacular shoals, but some fish which are found nowhere else but here. The Chagos anemone fish, which lives amongst the tentacles of large anemones, immune to their stings. And it's not just fish. Large schools of dolphins race through the clear waters. Over 15,000 kilometers to the west, the islands of the Caribbean territories are much more heavily populated, and the reefs here are more threatened. Big fish, like these Nassau groupers, have been heavily overfished. Even so, a few days after a full moon, they still form spawning aggregations. Impressive, but a fraction of what once used to happen. These aggregation sites need to be permanently protected, as they are some of the last examples of large grouper breeding aggregations that occur anywhere in the Caribbean. 8,000 kilometers from the warm Caribbean in the South Atlantic lies the remote territory of Tristan da Cunha. Ocean currents here create rich seas. Offshore, forests of giant kelp can reach over 40 meters in height. They shelter large shoals of fish, like five-fingers, and some, like this Tristan wrasse, are as colourful as fish from tropical reefs. These fish are prey for subantarctic fur seals. In such rich waters, there's plenty of food, and so plenty of time for play. Further south again is a land of ice, the British Antarctic Territory, surrounded by waters so rich that humpback whales migrate all the way here from tropical breeding grounds to feed. From icy waters to tropical reefs, the waters surrounding the UK overseas territories abound in life and protect some of the most important marine environments on Earth. The Britain's Treasure Islands book explores the unique wildlife, cultures and history of all of the UK overseas territories. Visit britainstreasureislands.com for details. In sincere thanks to Lord Ashcroft for funding the donation of one copy of the Britain's Treasure Islands book to every secondary school across the UK and her overseas territories. Thanks also to all Kickstarter backers and all sponsors and partners for making the 40 mini-documentaries possible. The plants of the UK overseas territories range from those of lush tropical rainforests of the Caribbean to the sparse flora of lichens and mosses in Antarctica. They're home to cacti and to coconut palms. Because many of the territories are tiny remote islands, evolution has had chance to create new species found nowhere else, like St. Helena's scrubwood or Pitcairn's yellow fatu. But the tiny size of many of these islands means that the flora of the UK overseas territories is at risk, especially from alien species brought here by humans. Ascension Island, in the centre of the Atlantic, is relatively young, erupting from the sea only 1 million years ago. In places, it is still barren, but it has been colonised naturally by ferns, whose tiny spores can blow on the wind across thousands of miles of ocean. But since it was discovered, Ascension has been deliberately flooded with exotic plants. In the 19th century, plants from all over the world were planted on the highest peak of the island. They quickly turned into the world's most cosmopolitan rainforest. It's hard to believe these were barren slopes just a few centuries ago. The purpose behind these introductions was to create a natural sponge to soak up moisture from clouds and condense it to provide the garrison stationed on the island with a water supply.
And the results couldn't be more efficient. There's been no rain up on this mountaintop today, but under this tree it's literally dripping with water. And as you can see, the roots are full of water.
Ascension was a military base, and it needed more than just water. Ships called in here for repairs, so Norfolk Island pines were also planted.
A ship with a broken mast is a bit like an aeroplane without an engine. It will drift out on the open ocean for kilometres until being wrecked ashore on some distant coastline. These trees are the only trees for thousands of kilometres, all the way from South America right down to Africa, that could be used as masts.
But these new species have pushed out many native Ascension species. But others proved more adaptable.
These plants here with the dark leaves, this is one of the 4 original species of ferns that grew on the mountain. So before the experiment began, there were 4 species and that's all that grew here. They basically grew down on the ash and the rocks on the exposed, barren, hot slopes. And of course now, since the vegetation has come and grown up as these tall trees, their habitat has been completely destroyed and lost. And what's really amazing is that they've actually grown and are growing now as epiphytes and adapted to this new habitat and so found a new niche which to fill.
Half a world away, Pitcairn Island in the Pacific Ocean has similar problems. It was colonised by the famous mutineers from the Bounty, and since then, native vegetation has been cut down or forced to compete with aliens, like these enormous banyans. There are 10 unique species of plants on Pitcairn. Some, like the yellow fatu, are now vanishingly rare.
Yeah, okay, so this is the yellow fatu, the aviatalon. We've only got 1 left growing in the wild, which is quite sad actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you know what? See in there? You see the little buds in there coming out?
It's both a privilege and a sobering experience to see this precious plant.
Within a week or so, I would say.
Even on the most remote islands, native plants are losing out to new introductions. The Chagos Archipelago lies in the centre of the Indian Ocean, a scattering of tiny islands. In the past, some of these islands were turned into coconut plantations, monocultures of coconut palms that replaced the native vegetation. But on some of the most remote islands in the archipelago, patches of the natural vegetation remain. Instead of endless coconut palms, there are forests with a dense understory of ferns. And growing out of them, magnificent native hardwood trees that provide nesting platforms for seabirds. Back in the Atlantic, the island of St. Helena lies only 1,300 kilometers from Ascension Island, but it's a very different place. It's much older, so there's been more time for plants to find and colonize it, and to evolve into new species. When the first explorers landed here, they found a green island with many unique species. But introduced plants, along with grazing animals, means that some of St. Helena's plants are now extinct, or extremely rare, and confined to the most remote places, like these scrubwood trees. Yet others are on the very brink of extinction.
This is one of the last two remaining bastard gumwood trees in the world. There's this tree here and another on the other side of the island, several kilometers away, and that's it for the species. The entire effort to save this tree from extinction rests on these two individuals.
But here, as on all the islands of the overseas territories, conservationists are working hard to save these unique species. On St. Helena, a specialist nursery has been set up to grow native plants, and conservationists have scoured the island for the last few remaining individuals as sources for seed, and with remarkable success.
So this one we have over here is the St. Helena boxwood. This one had disappeared. Disappeared off the records for about 100 years.
In the nursery, these precious plants are carefully tended and grown on.
And eventually we get to the point where we have a nice strong seedling in the bag here, and this one now is ready to go back and be planted in the wild.
And slowly, forests of St. Helena's unique trees and shrubs are regrowing. Although it's too late for many species of plants across the overseas territories, thanks to the work of dedicated conservationists, the future now looks brighter for many others. The Britain's Treasure Islands book explores the unique wildlife, cultures and history of all of the UK overseas territories. Visit britainstreasureislands.com for details. In sincere thanks to Lord Ashcroft for funding the donation of one copy of the Britain's Treasure Islands book to every secondary school across the UK and her overseas territories. Thanks also to all Kickstarter backers and all sponsors and partners for making the 40 mini-documentaries possible. Scattered across all 7 seas, the UK overseas territories are home to a rich diversity of invertebrates, from some of the rarest in the world to some of the largest and most spectacular. The Caribbean territories are heavily developed, yet amongst the holidaymakers and residents, there's space for creatures that pass their lives unnoticed by us. Where mangrove forests have escaped development, hordes of fiddler crabs emerge at low tide. The males use their enlarged claw to signal to rival males and to impress passing females. But twice a day, their homes are flooded as the tide sweeps in, transforming their world into an underwater forest. Most retreat to the bottom of their burrows to escape the notice of hungry fish. But a few seem so preoccupied with their displays, they continue underwater, on the prop roots of the mangroves. Since many of the overseas territories are small isolated islands without large land predators, they're great places for crabs. One of the most unlikely lives here, on remote Ascension Island, in the center of the equatorial Atlantic. It couldn't be more of a contrast to the lush landscapes of the Caribbean. Yet these jagged lava shores are the breeding beaches of Ascension land crabs. They've trekked down from the central peak in the island, many thousands of them, though they remain hidden. At their spawning sites such as this one, the crabs hide away during the heat of the day amongst these cool rocks where it's moist. But then when the night comes, they really become active. Under cover of darkness, the females venture onto the beaches. They're carrying huge numbers of eggs beneath their shell, and now they release them into the sea as waves break over them. Their larvae will drift on the ocean currents, which is how they found this tiny speck of land in the center of the ocean. But there's some even more curious crustaceans here. Much of the wildlife is localized to tiny areas. These little ponds here, this is the entire habitat for 2 species of shrimps. This is the only place in the world where they occur. Their nearest relatives live in seawater caves in the Caribbean. But how they got here is a mystery. One suggestion is that they used caves in underwater volcanoes, seamounts, as stepping stones. Life, it seems, can find even the most remote places. 1,300 kilometers to the southeast lies St. Helena, just as remote. But it's much older than Ascension, and so there's been more time for animals to discover this place, and once here, many evolved into new species. At least 460 unique invertebrates are found on this one island and occur nowhere else in the world. But introduced non-native species and grazing animals have caused huge problems for much of St. Helena's native wildlife. Between invasive plants and hungry mouths, St. Helena's unique vegetation has been pushed out from all but the most remote parts of the island, like these scrubwood bushes, or in some cases, species have been wiped out completely. And with these plants went many of the endemic invertebrates that depended upon them. Some of the invertebrates are extremely rare, with just a few hundred individuals left, or less in some species. Among this incredible diversity are the golden sail spider, with its shining triangular abdomen, the blushing snail, the scrubwood leafhopper, the Hellenian brown lacewing, the common red scarab beetle, the vulture leafhopper found only along the high central ridge, and Loveridge's hoverfly. Conservation teams are working hard to restore native plants and manage habitats for rare invertebrates, and not a moment too soon. The spiky yellow woodlouse is down to its last few individuals, one of the rarest animals on the planet. And for some, it's already too late. St. Helena had a giant earwig, now only a museum curiosity. We still don't know the full story of St. Helena's unique invertebrates. In these remote and spectacular landscapes, new discoveries are still being made. In 2015, 2 new species of parasitic wasps were found. One named after the exiled Napoleon Bonaparte, who spent the last 6 years of his life here. I'm not sure what the emperor would have made of this honor. He hated St. Helena's isolation. But it was the same isolation that created this biological treasure house, one like no other. A world away from St. Helena, in the center of the Indian Ocean, the British Indian Ocean Territory is made up of 7 huge coral atolls of the Chagos Archipelago. Of all of the overseas territories, this one is a kingdom of crabs. On the rocky shores, Sally Lightfoot crabs scavenge for anything edible. Sandy beaches are the domain of ghost crabs. And the forest floor in the interior of the islands is alive with land hermit crabs, wearing second-hand shells that have washed up from the reefs offshore. But there's one species of crab that rules supreme on these islands. It's called the coconut crab, and it's the largest land arthropod alive today. Coconut crabs live across the tropical Indian and Pacific Oceans, but most of the really big specimens have been killed for food. It's only in really remote places, like the Chagos Archipelago, that these giants, with legs spanning nearly 1 meter, still survive. As their name suggests, they live on coconuts, and their huge claws are big enough to smash their way through the tough husk. Armed and armored, they have little to fear from predators except humans. But young coconut crabs are easier prey. But since they're related to land hermit crabs, they can find an empty shell to use for protection until they're fully grown. They also have to find coconuts already broken open by the adults. For such a big animal, they're remarkably good climbers and can reach the top of coconut palms. On the UK mainland, a 3-centimetre long spider in the bath causes panic. But the overseas territories are home to some of the most spectacular invertebrates on the planet. The Britain's Treasure Islands book explores the unique wildlife, cultures and history of all of the UK overseas territories. Visit britain.treasureislands.com for details. In sincere thanks to Lord Ashcroft for funding the donation of 1 copy of the Britain's Treasure Islands book to every secondary school across the UK and her overseas territories. Thanks also to all Kickstarter backers and all sponsors and partners for making the 40 mini-documentaries possible.